sort of the waiting period. So I looked in the Bible, and there's this chapter called Thessalonians. It's really 2,000 years ago when Paul wrote a letter to the church of Thessalonica, and in it, there were family and friends that were dying, and basically they were concerned. They were wondering where they kind of knew that Jesus is going to return one day, and so they were asking, well, he's coming, but when? They were concerned that, let's say some of them were dying off, and how are they going to meet Jesus? And were the people who are still alive, were they going to miss out on Jesus' return? The question was, how long would they have to wait? And they kind of lived with this sort of one eye on the sky kind of thinking. They pulled away from their neighbours, they pulled away from their community, they pulled away from those outside the church. And Jesus, they said that Jesus would return, so they wanted to make sure that they were ready. They didn't want to miss it, but to be honest, it was all taking a bit longer than they were ready to accept. And so they were getting a bit anxious, and so they asked Paul, when is this going to happen? And can you give us a date? Can you give us a rough timeline? Can you give us a time frame? As we do, don't we? So Apostle Paul sort of gives them a response, and I love the way he responds. He doesn't spend much time answering the actual question, other than to tell them that it will happen all of a sudden, just like that, without warning. And Paul directs their attention away from the question of when. Instead, he points about how they should conduct themselves. And whilst they wait, Paul isn't interested in speculating about when Jesus will return. Instead, he offers assurance that we are God's children. We have hope in the salvation through Jesus Christ. But Paul's real concern is how they live in this time of waiting and uncertainty. So, it says, let us live in this expectancy that Jesus can return at any moment, and let's do the right thing, and let's serve Jesus in all that we do. So he gives them some instructions on how to live. So he says, let us be sober, putting on faith and love as our breastplate, and the hope of salvation as our helmet. And he shifts the instructions on how to live and instead to say, encourage one another and build each other up. So Paul makes a really interesting point for many things in our lives. He says, we don't know times and dates of when this will happen. It would be like a thief in the night. But because we don't know when this will happen, doesn't mean that we don't know that it will happen. And instead, Paul highlights the certainty that we do have. And he highlights that Christ will return and that we have received salvation through him. And so we ought not to be too concerned about times and dates, and instead be concerned about how we live and act in such a way that our lives give glory to God. And in our waiting, that our lives may draw others into the joy and the hope that we have in Jesus. So here's a couple of ways that I'm reaching out to build up others. I'm reaching out to one another, and I'm going to hope, so this is the sort of expectancy. Here's a couple of ways that I've thought would be really helpful. Let's reach out to one another, build each other up, and encourage one another. Okay, so that's one. The second one is, let's be gracious to our leaders, both in our church and outside. They're elected leaders and they're doing their best. And let our actions and our thoughts and our words and our social media posts show the love and the grace of God.